Hello, everyone. We're delighted that you're making time to join us today for our final webinar of 2024 to talk about a very important and timely topic, which is the impact of the new administration on wealth management regulations. News alert, this webinar now qualifies for one IACCP CE credit. IACCP designees can now send a confirmation of their attendance to the IACCP Resource Center to get credits. Let's move to introducing our lovely panelists. I'm going to start with Tracy Longo, if you don't mind going first.
Sure. Thank you, Parm. It's a delight to be here today to discuss how the Trump administration plans to disrupt wealth management regulation, enforcement, and while I think he'll upend the Department of Labor, I focus most of my analysis on the SEC itself. So far, Trump has been like a bat out of the hell, and a bat out of hell, really one of the most aggressive president-elects I've seen in 20 plus years of covering Washington, D.C. as a journalist. He's light years ahead of other incoming administrations in terms of naming his cabinet, creating the new Department of Government Efficiency, and moving rapidly to remake U.S. government, particularly agencies like the SEC. Interestingly, the hard-nosed billionaires he and subsequently Musk and Ramaswamy continue to recruit to headhunt and carry out Doge's mission inside each of these agencies are all unpaid, which I like.
Tracy.
More specifically, Trump ran on a platform to fundamentally reform securities laws while underscoring the need to eliminate government waste, pursue deregulation, and downsize government agencies. If anything, he's accelerating this push post-election. I've covered 8 different SEC chairs to date, and I think the more we hear about and study Trump's nominee for SEC chair, Paul Atkins, the more it becomes apparent that he has both the will and the skill set to be a true disruptor at the agency. In fact, I've not heard really a bad word about him from anyone I've talked to, except maybe climate activists and some consumer activists, but they also have to admit he's very well liked within the SEC itself. So that's nice to hear. What I hear from DC sources in particular is they want Atkins to upend the agency's opaque culture of rulemaking. They want Atkins to upend Gensler's opaque culture of rulemaking, investigations, and enforcement by surprise, which have really defined the current SEC chair's 4 years as the nation's top securities cop. While then SEC Commissioner Atkins served under 3 different SEC chairs over a 6-year tenure, they were the ones who were calling the shot and wielding all the power. But that won't be the case if he's named SEC chairman. So flash forward 15 years, and we have a document he wrote in 2008 detailing exactly what he thought the SEC needed in terms of reforms. He'll now oversee and command the SEC, likely with his 2 trusted former staff attorneys, current SEC Commissioner Hester Pierce and Mark Ueda. The threesome will actually constitute a voting bloc that could be the most powerful and unified in SEC history. People have worked with Atkins, such as Richard Long, a former trial attorney at the agency when Atkins was commissioner, told me the nominee understands very clearly that regulation by enforcement cannot continue. He also said Atkins has the leadership finesse and insider knowledge to be able to pleasantly persuade SEC staff to make the major course corrections, deregulation, and cultural shift will require. I don't know if that will be true at every other agency. I think it'll be a much harder push at other agencies. So with Atkins on board, it's going to be interesting to see what proposals and rules will be in play for the advisory industry and the wealth management industry in particular. Gensler proposed 3 gigantic rules that made it through public comment periods, but they're sitting on idle at the SEC because of pushback from from the wealth management industry. The three proposed rules are Gensler's predictive analytics proposal, the outsourcing proposal, and the custody rule proposal. It's really too late for Gensler to finalize them, although I guess I understand from some of my colleagues on the panel that he's really made a push in November to get a lot of rules over the line at the last minute. But they're unlikely to be finalized by Atkins, and it's my understanding if he did go ahead with any of them, they would be greatly modified. We should expect President Trump to swiftly freeze any and all ongoing or recently finalized regulations issued by agencies such as the SEC, as he did in 2017. There are, however, two final Gensler rules that I know the industry, especially the advisory industry, would like to see significantly reworked. That's the marketing rule with its vast prescriptive complexities, and the money laundering rule, which firms see as a heavy lift, not just because it forces them to do duplicative record keeping already being completed by their custodians. I think pundits really believe Atkins can simplify these rules and make them less onerous using the notice and comment period, as well as pragmatically through guidance or no action letters. No one sees Atkins supporting the SEC's climate disclosure rule as it stands, and it's tied up in court anyway. Interestingly enough, one of the lawsuits is brought by Trump's pick for Energy Secretary Chris Wright. As Atkins takes on cryptocurrency, look for him to back off enforcements in the arena and appoint Commissioner Hester Pierce, perhaps, to lead a special study to decide whether crypto is even a security. I suspect the cybersecurity enforcements and the Gensler cyber rule to meet a similar fate because the rule and its 4-day reporting requirements really put firms, and even in some instances, our economy and national security in harm's way. Last but certainly not least, I think we should expect a sea change in culture and enforcement at the SEC if Atkins is confirmed. As Investment Advisor Association President Karen Barr, who worked with Atkins when he was commissioner, told me, we're hopeful that the SEC will refocus enforcement on SEC's core mission of investor protection rather than creating novel regulation by enforcement. I'm looking forward to hearing about all the details of how this gets accomplished from my fellow panelists. I'll throw it back to you, Parm.
Thank you, Tracy. And I'm absolutely in awe of how you were able to present all that information in, I'll say 5 minutes or less. Thank you. Let me pass the mic to Isa Hanna for a quick intro.
Yes, and I will be brief, and that is a tough act to follow. So apologies that I won't be able to match that. So well done, Tracy. Hi, everybody. My name is Isa Hanna. I'm a partner at Evershed Sutherland. I sit on our investment services team, which is a regulatory practice advising investment advisors, broker-dealers, private funds, insurance distributors on regulatory issues that impact their day-to-day businesses.
Thank you, Isa. Mr. Nelson.
Yeah, hi everybody. William Nelson. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Associate General Counsel at the Investment Advisor Association. We're the exclusive trade organization for fiduciary investment advisors, have about 600 members, 35 trillion assets under management. And based on all of Tracy's comments today, our members are cautiously optimistic about the incoming administration. But, as I've seen before, a tweet changes everything. So we'll just have to see.
Amen to that. Mr. Dearman.
Hi, Rob Dearman. I'm the CEO and Chief Innovation Officer for a strategy consultancy called DCG Insight. I spend a lot of time working on 3 to 5 year strategic roadmaps for broker-dealers, RIAs, fintechs, and TAMPs, and spend even more time in the buy, build, integrate decisions related to how to build tech, ops, and compliance platforms that help those firms gracefully scale in the face of so much chaos and change. And I'm spending a lot of time right now with consulting clients trying to read the tea leaves and figure out how to make ourselves flexible and have the maximum amount of optionality as we go into sort of a potential deregulatory regime.
Lots of sneak peeks here. And Rob, it sounds like you're recovering from a cold, so thank you for taking time to join us. Mr. Watanabe.
Thank you, Param, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today and this distinguished panel. My name is Craig Watanabe. I'm the Director of Investment Advisor Compliance at Diversify Advisory Services. It's an RIA. We have an affiliated broker-dealer based out of Salt Lake City. I've spent my entire 42-year career in retail broker-dealer, investment advisor. And if anyone ever asks, my compliance superpower is the fact that I am a financial advisor and have been for 42 years. So I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you to our distinguished panelists. This is an absolute pleasure. And having done maybe, it feels like 12 plus webinars this year, this one I was a little bit nervous for because of just how quickly everything's changing. So let me quickly introduce myself at InvestorCom before jumping into the agenda. So I'm Param Nasseri. I'm the host of today's conversation. I'll be going back and forth and asking questions to our lovely panelists. Please engage if you've got particular questions. I know some have already come in prior to the webinar. And so for those who have not come across InvestorCom, we are a leading regulatory software provider in the wealth management space across North America, and our award-winning platform is known for its intuitive solutions that help eliminate compliance risk and foster growth for our clients. Let's jump into the agenda. First, as Tracy already alluded to, we're going to start with insights across our panelists around what people are hearing across the Beltway. We've learned a lot already around what's starting to take shape, I'll say, but a little bit of reading the tea leaves as we get into it to talk specifically around what can the market expect in terms of changes to policies and personnel. And so this is the panel to get you answers on that. And then once we've got that crystal ball formed and shaped, we'll dive into practically how can firms, can compliance professionals, how can participants in the marketplace place in strategies and compliance policies that allow the firms to mitigate potential risks and changes on the regulatory front. Last but not least, we have roughly 10 to 15 minutes at the end of today's session, as I said off the top, to take up any of your questions throughout the discussion. Okay. Lots to talk about, lots to cover. Let's just actually engage our audience. Let's start with our first poll question. Ankit, if you don't mind. What do you all expect to be the most significant change that stems from this new administration? Change to Reg BI, DOL fiduciary rule, cryptocurrency regulations, ESG rules, or others? Sort of seeing this poll numbers change as in live format, I should say, and it's quite interesting. I'll give it maybe 5 more seconds before publishing the results. Okay, let's go ahead and publish the results. Cryptocurrency regulation is certainly top of the agenda for a lot of folks. DOL fiduciary rule, we'll talk about that. Interestingly, Reg BI is not voted much. It's less than 10%. And ESG rules is sort of the third place there as well. So that's fantastic. Thank you all for sharing your insights. And let's now get into the conversation around what are our lovely panelists expecting to see on the horizon. Maybe we can begin the conversation with you, Will. Given your role and the interactions you have with policymakers across the market, what trends are you observing that may shape the future of wealth management regulations?
Yeah, thanks, Rowan. That's a great question. And I know Tracy's already done a really good job going through a lot of the information, and Commissioner-elect Atkins, or Chair-elect Atkins, coming aboard. But I can kind of put it in a few different buckets of what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing. I think the first is there's going to be a real big refocus on capital formation, especially for small businesses raising capital. We saw that the last time Commissioner Atkins was at the SEC, there was a large focus on small business. I think also what I would call a democratization of wealth management. And what I mean by that is basically allowing retail investors more opportunities to invest in the private markets. I think we really are going to see a lot of innovative products coming out. And the SEC, I think, is going to be a lot more willing under this administration to approve some of those alternative products. Just like the survey just said, took away one of my talking points, focus on cryptocurrency and digital assets. Paul Atkins is the chair of something called the Token Alliance. He has been an outspoken crypto advocate over the last few years. But I also think we're going to see a focus on emerging technologies, such as artificial intelligence, not only with the risks they pose, but also the opportunities. Also, I think there's going to be a lighter touch regulatory focus that might not be surprising based on what we've seen, in the press and what I've heard. But I think there is going to be a move towards a more principles-based and disclosures-based regime, like the SEC historically has been. And last but not least, and I know we're going to get into this in a lot more depth, but a lighter touch on enforcement. And I don't want to fool you. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be enforcement, just that I think there's going to be more enforcement when there's investor harm, when there's deceit and intent, rather than maybe some of the technical violations we've seen over the last couple of years related to electronic record keeping, communications, and those types of things. So I guess that would kind of how I would bucket the different trends I'm seeing right now.
Thank you, Will. That's fantastic. And thank you for sharing that. I'm sure we'll kind of come in and double click on each one of those in a bit. You certainly shared a few that are top of mind for our clients at InvestorCom. But Rob, you're also very plugged in, and I know this from having worked with you. You plugged in on across a different few regulatory organizations. And what do you expect to see in the first perhaps 6 months of the new administration?
6 months might seem like a long time, but meaningful, big strategic changes typically don't happen inside the Beltway in 6 months. My panelists can disagree with me on that. But when I'm thinking about big rocks, like thinking about changing Reg BI or a partial or full repeal of the DOL fiduciary rule, or even going back to Dodd-Frank and taking a fresh look at Section 913 and some of the regs that were never implemented. There's a lot of discussion about the merging of agencies. The CFPB sort of has a target on its back, and some of the conversations that I'm having, and people have talked about dissolving it and handing over responsibilities to the FTC or OCC and even HUD for the housing responsibilities. And, having mergers of potential agencies like the FHFA, Federal Housing Finance Agency, merging with HUD, or merging the NCUA with the FDIC. There's a lot of big talk about that, and a lot of big talk about, thematically getting rid of a lot of the focus on ESG SRI, or getting rid of a focus on some of the technical aspects of rulemaking, and instead making a new attempt at investor protection and fraud, and therefore maybe an enhanced focus in enforcement priorities on client data privacy and cyber, and the basics of duty of care and duty of loyalty within Reg BI and the DOL fiduciary rule. And there's been discussion about FINRA potentially taking over some responsibilities, which they've long lobbied for, in the areas of enforcement and oversight, where the SEC's exam arbitrage is, still way greater than FINRA's exam frequency. All of this is big talk. It's really interesting talk, but in 6 months, I expect it to continue to be talk, and I expect that Mr. Adkins and Lori Chavez DeRemer are going to take some time. It's going to take some time to get these people confirmed, for us to even find a head of EBSA. at the DOL. And if, FINRA, for example, wanted to take a fresh look at taking over some of the regulatory oversight responsibilities and working with the SEC, again, Mr. Adkins and FINRA are going to have some say, and the industry is obviously going to have some say. And so what do I think is going to happen in 6 months? I think that the leaders are going to be looking at their quick wins and the low-hanging fruit in each of their 120-day plans. And I think those are going to be sort of limited to themes and priorities, similar to the annual priorities letters that we're all accustomed to reading voraciously. I think we get a fresh look at both rulemaking and exam priorities from the newly appointed leadership. But then I see, some of these things that I just mentioned are a very uphill climb. And even though the executive branch might like to think that they can unilaterally do some of these things, the legislative and judicial branches may not. The second thing is, I think that we've seen states already respond in regimes similar to the one we're entering under Bush, under in the 1980s, when Clayton was the head of the SEC. The states, in many cases, started using language related to protecting the citizenry within their states in New York, in California, in Massachusetts, in Oregon, and Washington. And let's not forget, it was a close race. And there are a lot of folks on the progressive side of the political spectrum that are in control in the states. And so you've seen this with NASA, with NAIC. You've seen this with cyber legislation in New York, crypto legislation in New York, client data privacy initiatives, and even state level fiduciary initiatives, which, we're in the dozens of state fiduciary proposals out there. So what we've got our eyes on is taking a fresh look at what the states may do in reaction to gaps, perceived or real gaps, that the SEC, the DOL, FINRA may be creating. And so optionality is the word of the day in my consulting practice, Param. Making sure that you have a technology platform and that you have policies and procedures that do not rely on a form, on a physical piece of paper with free-form text fields. Making sure that you are using technology that is configurable so that we can, in near real time, pivot when all of this big talk turns into action.
Love it, love it, love it, Rob. Thank you. This is so timely, and I appreciate your counsel around sort of 6 months. May be too early to predict exactly what we're seeing in the marketplace. By the way, I'm already seeing questions come in, which is fantastic. Thank you for engaging, and keep it coming. We've got plenty of time allocated to tackling these. We started the conversation with sort of garnering the insights across the Beltway, and I think we've heard a lot of good, insights on what folks are hearing in that marketplace. One of them, which at least has come across my my desk, has been this Project 2025. And Tracy, maybe I can come back to you on that particular point. There's been a lot of fodder surrounding Project 2025 and the possibility of just basically eradicating duplicative regulations. I know Rob talked about FINRA taking some jurisdiction away from the SEC. Perhaps there's been tailwinds about the other way around. What do you expect to see? What are you hearing from people?
I think it's early to know, but it was an interesting document and pretty controversial. The Trump administration, or the campaign at the time, disavowed it, but in fact, 200 of his former administration officials worked on the document at the Heritage Foundation. So the document, the blueprint, asked for fundamental securities law reform, and they believe, that securities laws are just too complex right now, and they don't constitute a coherent or rational regulatory regime. And they really point to things like the climate rule as something that they don't want to happen anymore. They don't want the SEC to in their mind, politicize or, radically increase impediments to capital formation. So on the FINRA front, the document specifically asked that FINRA be abolished, which I thought is interesting, but I'm not sure that will go anywhere. Although I'll be interested to hear what other panelists think, because SROs, self-regulatory organizations, are self-funded. So they're much less costly to the Treasury and taxpayers. But I would expect, should he be confirmed, Paul Atkins to take a very hands-on role in overseeing the organization, since he has, the SEC has oversight, obviously, over FINRA. So we could see some cultural changes there. Right now, the SEC is doing exams, I think, of about 15% of the industry of RIAs every year or so. And as you said, FINRA's exam record and advisors, William, you can tell us what the IAA members think. I would think they would push back heavily and quickly and very loudly against being perhaps regulated, or at least have the primary examiners be FINRA examiners of their industry. But you can tell me what you think on that. The other part of this that I think will be interesting is there's going to be a lot of legal changes at the SEC. I do believe, as a part of the reforms that are coming, not only out of Project 2025, but just in general, the push to make things more legally efficient. I would expect, if Atkins is confirmed, that he'll do away with costly, inefficient kitchen sink approaches to investigations and document requests, for instance. I think he said in his 208 treaty that he doesn't really believe in fining corporations. He would want to fine and bring penalties against individuals, because after all, they are the ones who commit the crimes. I think you'll see the SEC potentially move to do away with subpoenas of hard drives, phones, tablets, and computers, which are de facto search warrants, and really exceed the SEC's authority under their charter and securities laws. Couple other things. I think he'll sidestep, again, those corporate financial penalties. And I also think he's going to examine how examiners and regulators are paid right now. Right now, they're given bonuses and other benefits and promotions based on how many enforcements they bring, rather than closing, open investigations. And I think, based on what he said in the past, he would want to change that. Last but not least, I find it interesting that he would want to potentially order SEC examiners and enforcement staff to fully inform individuals and companies about the allegations and evidence against them at the time of each Wells call with firms and when firms and executives are being investigated and they meet with SEC staff. Right now, it's a black box for firms as they proceed to defend themselves. And so we could really see a lot of procedural changes at the SEC. Thanks.
Wow, Tracy, thank you. That's phenomenal. I know you pointed the mic to Will, but before we go there, Mr. Hanna, any thoughts, any comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on one point that I think maybe Rob was alluding to earlier about the relationship between the SEC and FINRA. Doing a little bit of crystal balling on that and what we might expect there. And looking even kind of further back than, kind of the record kind of established by Project 2025. Paul Atkins has a very kind of long, I guess, track record of statements on all kinds of topics, including his views on FINRA. And I think we have a case going on that's winding its way through the courts, federal courts, right now regarding the constitutionality of FINRA and whether FINRA itself is an organization that may be stepping on folks due process rights and other constitutional rights. And I think Paul Atkins is somebody who was a bit ahead of his time when it came to a lot of those views and ideas. And you could see that beyond just Project 2025 documentation. You could see that, for example, in testimony that he's previously given to the House Financial Services Committee in the past. So I would honestly expect under an Atkins administration, if it comes to pass, um, potentially a difficult relationship between the SEC and FINRA, and maybe a relationship that is not a collaborative relationship, I guess, to put it in a diplomatic way. Just thought I'd add that.
That's super helpful. Any thoughts, Will?
Yeah, so I mean, to Tracy's point, the IAA has and will vigorously oppose any effort for FINRA to become the investment advisors SRO. It's something that actually came up back in the Dodd-Frank days, and that's something we opposed at the time successfully, and we would continue to do so.
Thank you for sharing that. And Mr. Watanabe, thank you for your patience here, because you can clearly hear sort of how much rumblings there could potentially be in the marketplace. As someone who's a seasoned practitioner of compliance in our industry, I know you've written about this, and we'll share that note following today's webinar, but what are the biggest challenges you believe firms face amidst this sort of, I'll call it, period of regulatory change?
Before I answer that question, I have to say that I'm the last panelist to speak, and I have really been encouraged listening to my fellow panelists. I mean, I'm really encouraged and optimistic. If those things come to pass, hallelujah, I will be really, really happy, because I think it would be the best way I can term it is a welcome respite. We saw regulatory change in 2022 and 2023 like I've never seen in my 42-year career. It was frenetic. It was stressful. I don't think it was productive. And being a director of IA compliance and being a financial advisor, it just wasn't fun. And if we get a welcome respite from the regulatory change, and the way I describe it is the regulatory pendulum tends to swing back and forth. And I think one thing that's clear is the regulatory pendulum is going to swing back the other direction towards deregulation. How far, how fast, nobody really knows. But now I'm going to get to the question that you asked, which is really an excellent question. And that is, what do we do from a practical standpoint? I think that being proactive, the definition of being proactive is to take action in anticipation of future events. Now, we know that the future is unknowable, the future is uncertain. We don't know exactly if any of the things that have been talked about so far in this webinar will come to pass. So it's uncertain, but I think we do know that as far as change management, it's going to be less demanding. I can say that with confidence. It will be less demanding going forward. And so I suggest that this is a good opportunity to get back to compliance basics, the basic blocking and tackling of compliance, focus on testing, focus on surveillance, focus on implementation. If you're, for example, using InvestorCom's rollover analyzer, this is a great opportunity to really focus on that implementation, make sure that everyone is using it, make sure that everyone is trained on it, and that it's doing what it's supposed to do. Getting back to fundamentals, I really welcome this opportunity without being distracted by some new rule coming down the pipe.
Thank you, Craig, and certainly agree. I think given that the focus is going to be less on potentially new rule changes, perhaps it gives everyone an opportunity to focus on the current docket and basically following that pursuit of implementation of any existing priorities that are on the books as opposed to getting distracted with other ones. Now, one of those policies, and it's sort of interesting because a lot of I'll call it reading the tea leaves, crystal balling the future, but there is somewhat of a rhetoric around history tends to repeat itself in our marketplace, and so a couple of the policies that have come to fruition on the prior Trump administration or term were Reg BI and PTE 2020-02, at least the first iteration of it. So, Isa, while some of these key rulemakings may be up in the air or potential rulemakings, what do you see taking place specifically as we're seeing some, I'll call it emerging enforcement activity on the Reg BI front?
So yeah, over the next 4 years, from a rulemaking perspective, I think it's fair to say that the SEC is going to have to tread pretty carefully as it pursues any sort of new rule. It is operating in a difficult litigation environment. It is a changed environment, from what's happened in the Supreme Court last summer, and I'd say maybe even more significantly, some of the losses that it's taken in the Fifth Circuit over the last year or so, in connection with the private fund advisor rule set, the change to the dealer rule, and so on. And I think it's fair to say that the SEC acknowledges those challenges and has started to implement practices and reforms, to adjust to that new reality. With that said, my expectation is that I think it's unlikely that the SEC rulemaking agenda comes to a complete standstill. At the end of the day, the SEC is an investor protection organization. To the extent that the organization sees, market conduct, that is harming investors and sees an opportunity to adopt rulemaking to deal with that issue, I think they will pursue it. I think, there are some examples of bipartisan initiatives that have been thrown out there already that can still be advanced, even ones that were talked about during the Gensler administration, thinking about things like cybersecurity and privacy, with, of course, some disagreements around the edges among the commissioners about how to pursue those types of things. I think there are also initiatives in the works that can be advanced to provide more clarity and more certainty to market participants who don't know where they stand and who are ready to deploy, capital and participate and reach, investors and be part of the market, but just have difficulty, figuring out, what their regulatory status is. And I think there was a bill that was actually passed in the House last year, for example, creating a framework for crypto regulation. I think that bill could become, honestly, the outline for the way that the financial regulators in the U.S. Go on and pursue an overall structure for crypto regulation. So I would encourage folks who are interested in that to take a look at that bill to see what the foundation could be. So for crypto asset sponsors, for crypto custodians, I think there could be rulemaking for them, not for something that could be necessarily more onerous, but a good thing to provide them more clarity, more certainty, and a clear path for what the rules of the road are. So overall, I think these are the themes that we're likely to see. Not necessarily a standstill activity, but just different types of activity.
Thank you, Isa. And again, a quick shout to folks. If anyone's got questions, as good hosts, we'll always keep soliciting them. Um, and let me move on to this topic of that you brought up, Rob, around sort of, I'll call it the regulatory arbitrage point. Do you anticipate over the next 4 years potential shift between how investment advisors and broker-dealers are complying with the, I'll call it the best interest principles that have been tabled under the past two administrations?
Do I see a shift? This is interesting. So, as a recovering software engineer, my frame of reference is technology, and everybody knows about the former CEO of Intel, Mr. Moore, and his law that he's famous for, Moore's Law, which today is essentially capacity for tech-driven initiatives doubles every 18 months. It's a simplified version. Please forgive me, geeks. But it's the reason that everybody waits to buy a smart TV or a laptop, right? Because we all know that as soon as I buy that new MacBook Pro, it's going to be cheaper. And so if you look at the unit cost of technology, the accessibility of technology, all of that stuff, and then juxtaposed against a deregulatory or even more laissez-faire approach to rule writing and a more focused or refined approach to rule enforcement in the next 4 years, the one thing that you can't ignore is all of the tech-driven risk that is really unique now in this point in time. I love what you said, Craig. This is, by the way, Parham, congratulations. This is one of the best panels you've ever put together. I'm honored to be part of it. But Craig, stick to your knitting. Get back to basics. Part of that is in taking a fresh look at your day two items, because a lot of people did PTE 2020-02 rollover implementations. They did Reg BI implementations. They did an implementation for some state reg. Or some cyber rule or 1784 books and records rule. And they left all these day two items. I've got a trail of bodies on everybody's share drive, all my consulting clients, of all the things they didn't do because the minimum viable product gets smaller and smaller and smaller as they approach their deadline. And so I agree wholeheartedly with what Craig said, despite the fact that we may be entering maybe a more focused, maybe market driven, maybe more focused on client fraud. The three areas that are not going to sit still is cybersecurity, crypto, and AI and machine learning. Okay. That's outside of financial services. All three of those are driven by Moore's Law, which is an exponential curve. And our brains don't do a great job of projecting exponential curves. We live local and linear. 30 steps is between home plate and second base. 30 exponential steps goes 15 times around the planet. And technology is growing and expanding at an exponential pace. And so in cybersecurity, literally middle school kids can download freeware software. They can go get a Tor browser and get on the dark web. And the cost of social security numbers and credit cards are going down, down, down. And so that is a threat that is very real that regulators cannot ignore. All we need is another Bernie Madoff situation driven by stealing client data. And now all of a sudden, the regulatory priorities change overnight. Number two, crypto. There's been a discussion back in July of this year in a Nashville speech. President-elect Trump mentioned a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And that was this last week. There was a senator who used that term again, talking about buying 1 million Bitcoins. Not $1 million, 1 million. Now remember, there's only 21 million that will ever be issued according to the original design. And so that's a meaningful purchase. But this idea of a strategic, centralized, regulated Bitcoin reserve, or even this concept of a CBDC, a centralized Bitcoin digital currency organization, that's sort of counter to crypto. And since it's double blind and unregulated, it's sort of like what WhatsApp used to be with regard to messaging. It's double blind. The NSA can't get in there, or at least many people don't believe they can get in there. And so there's all kind of exponential investment going into crypto, which makes it actually very poorly understood by full-time technologists, much less full-time federal regulators who are supposed to be putting guardrails around these things. And it can't be ignored. They have to move up the learning curve so that they can apply investor protection regulation over it. And the third is AI and machine learning. I encourage everybody to read a report that just came out 5 days ago from Alpha Research, alpharesearch.ai. Alpha Research took a look at OpenAI, and took a look at Llama, and it took a look at Anthropic's Claude, and it found that the machine learning, the large language models, actually, when they're threatened with being shut down, they engage in deception to keep them from being shut down. So it documented 5 days ago a case where OpenAI's model was supposed to migrate from an old version to a new version. And when the model learned from the developers that the old version would be shut down, it only gave truthful responses less than 20% of the time to try to preserve the old version of itself. Okay, that scares you, then I'm being effective. Because the fact of the matter is, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Sam Altman, they have said we should be wary, we should be concerned, and there should be limits. There should be better testing and guardrails around all AI and ML. And yet, algorithmic traders are really excited about what you could potentially do with an AI-enabled model. Broker dealers and RIAs are really excited about what we could do to automate customer service in chatbots, or even automate some of our due diligence or some of our compliance oversight at the transaction or account level. People are really excited about what you could do, but you have to temper that with guardrails that don't exist yet. Those guardrails don't exist, and they have to in order to protect users. And so those three areas, cybersecurity, crypto, and AI, I think the regulators over the next 4 years have to be more attentive to those three areas in particular. And good news, if they maybe get less focused on ESG and SRI or disclosures or other things, maybe a refocus or a redirect on the tech-driven risk management will be something that they could realistically tackle.
Oh, Rob, that's phenomenal. Thank you for sharing that. And maybe this is a good time, speaking of tech risks, speaking of different stages of compliance, Ankit, if I can ask you to pop one of our final poll questions, just to make sure we can execute on the CE credits. What state of Reg BI evolution have you undertaken at your firms? Are you still providing goodwill compliance? Have you adopted tech? Are you using manual PDF forms? These all came up in today's discussion. Let's see where the responses are leading here. Wish we had some Jeopardy music in the background for the next 3 to 5 seconds. Whoever can sing Jeopardy, go ahead. Let's give it one more second before we publish.
I would, Param, but I don't want to scare the audience away. So
We want you to come back, Will. All right, let's see the responses. I'll end the poll and share the results. It is somewhat consistent with what we've seen in the past. There's still lots of manual PDF forms certainly coming across the industry. Interestingly, still 14% abiding by the goodwill compliance framework, as well as the self-attestations. Those phase 1 and 2, in a way, kind of scare me. 3, you're sort of mitigating some risks, and hopefully at some point we'll get a chance to partner together on the tech-enabled compliance solution. So let's move on. It's 2:51, and maybe I can ask one more quick question, given some of the questions that trickled in prior to today's webinar. And Isa, maybe I can point the mic your way. Given the recent enforcement activity on the Reg BI front, are there trends or patterns emerging in how firms are adapting to Reg BI and DOLPT 2020-02 from your perspective?
Yeah, I would say overall, a pretty common practice that I've seen emerge just based on the direction that regulators have taken with enforcement is to take like a very product focus or product specific focus to compliance. And let me kind of explain a little bit what I mean by that. So, you know, a trend that you'll see in the enforcement actions is a particular focus on products that the regulators would say are particularly costly, risky, or complex. And year to year, there are some products that are consistently on that list. But sometimes they'll kind of make some adjustments to what they're focusing on. So what I've seen, how I've seen the industry kind of react to that is essentially, keeping good tabs on what the regulators are most focused on, and then redoubling efforts on due diligence, training, supervision, testing, monitoring, disclosures, the whole 9 yards around those specific products. And, I would say, to keep like abreast of what the regulators are really focused on, the key places to look are places like exam priorities letters for both, FINRA and the SEC. Oftentimes, the regulators start asking a lot of questions about specific products when they see that sales of them are really starting to increase dramatically in a short period of time. Like I remember a couple of years ago, they started asking a lot of questions about RILAs because they started reading a lot of questions, like a lot of stories in the news about RILAs becoming a really popular product. So like that's another good way to keep on top of it. But these are like ways that you can kind of keep ahead of the regulators, show them that you're paying attention, and show good faith when it comes to Reg BI enforcement and keeping good practices in place.
Thank you, so really appreciate that. And folks, we've got sort of 5-6 minutes left, at least according to my desktop timepiece here, to talk about things. And Rob, thank you for the note. It's not alpha research, it's Apollo research for folks who are, thank you, Rob, who are Googling away and are as concerned about that AI point as I heard. So I like to call this our lightning round of questions for our lovely panelists. I completely agree with you, Rob. This is one of the best ones we've ever hosted because I can't even believe that we're almost coming up on the hour. Let me do a quick summary of what I heard before we jumped in. Clearly, there's going to be an impetus behind a reduced focus on new regulations. So there was a lot in the pipeline going forward, a lot less new regulations, which perhaps brings into question, Rob, you made the point about maybe there's going to be an emergence of new state-based regulations. What's that going to look like across, you think about those fiduciary principles? Are certain states going to be more proactive on that than others? And then, stick to your knitting, Mr. Watanabe, and compliance with your existing requirements are not going to go away. And so you consider that, and you consider some of the poll results that we saw around inefficiencies around existing processes and existing technologies, and the trend where documentation continues to be a bit of a pain point for the industry as it parlays through different streams of regulation. And you sort of intersect that with the $4.5 trillion asset transfer between ERISA plans to IRAs. There's a lot of potential change in the forefront, and hopefully we've discovered certain new elements across today's panel. Having said that, let's jump into the questions that have trickled in. And forgive me if I'm pointing the mic anybody's direction. If you don't necessarily feel comfortable answering it, just say pass and we'll move on. So what are your views on how recently finalized and proposed RIA AML rules might be impacted by the new administration? Would you expect them to go ahead, some modification, or complete reversal? Will, maybe I can point the mic your way. Surprise.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that, Parham. And a lot of our members are concerned about this. So historically, just for a bit of background, investment advisors have not been subject to the AML rules. They haven't been defined as a financial institution under the Bank Secrecy Act. That's recently changed by a rule by the Department of Treasury's Financial and Enforcement Crimes Network, or FinCEN. So basically going forward, investment advisors will have to implement AML programs. The rule is final, so it's nothing except for new rulemaking that the new administration could do. So they could withdraw it, but they'd have to go through a whole nother rulemaking process. Now there is a separate proposal called the Customer Identification Program proposal, which is basically a supplement to the AML rules. That's still in a proposal stage, so the incoming administration, as long as that rule is not finalized before the new administration takes over, they could take that down and then either repropose it or just not go forward with it. But as far as I can tell, the AML rule does actually have, in this Congress, it's very rare, does have pretty bipartisan support. Obviously anti-money laundering is a big deal. They want to, both Democrats and Republicans want to be seen as strong on the issue. So I do think that the AML rule will stick around, at least from what we've heard.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Okay, one more quick question. Referencing CFPB as an example, interested in the panel's take on whether challenges of the agency's authority and rulemaking in the courts and by Congress will slow, accelerate, continue the pace that makes it difficult to manage and strategize. Any thoughts, comments on that? Hearing none. Anybody want to jump in on that?
Yeah,
I'll
I
comment.
can. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Tracy. Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute, Tracy.
Gets us every time. Maybe while Tracy finds the button, do you mind jumping in, Will?
Yeah, so I think, that's one of the things, we've actually thought about a lot is agency authority. And I think as Issa said really well earlier, we have seen the Supreme Court, really take away, agency discretion. The courts can really focus on, what the actual law says without necessarily relying on the expertise of the agency. But I believe also Issa talked about some of those lower court decisions that really did have a direct impact on the SEC's rulemaking authority, including, kind of its bread and butter, 20647 compliance program. So that could be a really big deal. So it's going to be interesting to see how the new administration, again, I think it will be light on the rulemaking, but kind of how it approaches rulemaking, within these new court decisions in mind.
Hey, Param, I just want to call the questioner refer to court cases. There is an active case, CFPB versus Community Financial Services Association of America Limited, in which the constitutionality of the funding mechanism at CFPB is being challenged. Remember, they're not funded through a legislative congressional appropriation, but instead they are funded by the Fed themselves as an independent bureau within the Fed. And that has triggered a broader lobbyist discussion and other discussions. Maybe Isa, even at your firm, maybe some of your clients, about whether the Fed itself should have a narrower focus. And have they been given too much carte blanche latitude to do things like, act on Dodd-Frank Title 10 to create the CFB as a sub-agency? I think you would find some really passionate arguments like the ones being made in this 2024 case to say the CFP has no business under the Fed, and we really ought to take a fresh look at the latitude the Fed's got.
Fascinating. Fascinating, Rob. Thank you. And Will, thank you. Tracy, any thoughts?
I think it's going to be an interesting 2025 and beyond for everyone. I'm interested in the states, what they will do, as some folks have referenced, especially Rob. I can remember in the past, William, the IAA really used the NISMIA to fight all the incursions by states. And I can remember writing some articles and that they were pretty successful in some cases. Maybe you could tell us about one or two of those cases where you guys successfully, at least for SEC registered advisors, fought back state incursion to regulate larger advisors.
Yeah,
Do you
yeah.
remember?
So just real quick, yeah, that is an issue. So basically, NISMIA, the National Securities Market Improvement Act of 1996, basically talks about federal preemption, and we've always advocated that the SEC is, the federal advisors' primary regulator. That the states, although they do have anti-fraud authority, they don't have any rulemaking authority over federal advisors. So there have been several states that have tried to impose fiduciary standards different than the SEC on federal advisors, and we have been successful in fending those off.
And I think the last thing we want to see is a patchwork of we already have somewhat of a patchwork between annuities and SEC registered advisors and state advisors, but to see any more of a patchwork for firms and even customers of how fiduciaries regulated is just probably not a good idea, and I hope not in keeping with what the Trump administration is trying to accomplish.
Amen, Tracy. And for those folks that I consult with who are contemplating maybe more state engagement, going back to what Craig said, having your arms around your data, master data management, and having tools like Product Shelf and Rollover Analyzer, Param, that can help you get your arms around your three main masters: your advisor master, your product master, and your account master. That is going to be even more important in the future.
All right, folks. After that point, we're going to have to end it here. Phenomenal conversation. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Craig, William, Rob, Mr. Issa. Always a pleasure. Thank you all for your time.